I have to go.
No. Stay. Please stay.
The wind cut like a skinning knife as the stagecoach dropped a trembling young woman at the foot of the Bitterroot Trail. Her only companions a small carpetbag and a letter that smelled faintly of lavender. She was to be the bride of a mountain man she'd never met, a giant of a fellow named Silas Creed, who lived so high up that the clouds tangled in his beard. The matchmaker in town had warned her that Silas was as shy as a wild elk and that he'd probably never spoken more than 10 words to a woman in his entire life. But the girl, whose name was Patience Wren, had secrets of her own and a heart that had been set on this particular mountain man since she was a child of 9 winters. She began the long climb, a thin boot slipping on the pine needles, while the setting sun painted the peaks the color of a fresh bruise, and she whispered a prayer that he would not send her away. Now, before we uncover why this shy bride already knew her groom's soul, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a frontier love story that'll warm your heart. Silas Creed was splitting firewood when he heard the faint crunch of footsteps, and he straightened up so suddenly that he nearly cracked his head on a low pine branch. Standing at the edge of his clearing was the smallest woman he had ever seen, clutching a bag and looking at him with eyes so full of quiet recognition that it unsettled him deeply. He dropped his axe and wiped his hands on his trousers, suddenly aware that his shirt was patched and his hair was a wild tangle of dark curls dusted with sawdust. Patience took a step forward, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "I am the bride the pastor wrote to you about, and I promise I will work hard and cause you no trouble." Silas's throat closed up entirely, and all he could do was nod dumbly and gesture toward the cabin, silently cursing himself for not knowing how to act around a woman. The cabin was neat but sparse, with a stone hearth and a single bed in the corner, and Patience looked around with an expression not of disappointment but of deep relief. Silas cleared a space at the table and awkwardly offered her a tin cup of water, his massive fingers trembling so much that he spilled half of it on the floorboards. Patience took the cup with both hands, and when her small fingers brushed against his, a jolt of something electric and ancient shot all the way up his arm and lodged in his chest. They sat in painful silence for a full 10 minutes, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a wolf down in the valley. Finally, Patience gathered her courage and asked if he was disappointed that she was so plain and small, because she knew mountain men usually wanted sturdy wives who could wrestle a calf. Silas's head jerked up and he stared at her as if she had just suggested the sun was made of molasses, because to his eyes she was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. He managed to stammer out, "You ain't playing, ma'am. You're as purty as a meadow in June, and I'm the one who's all thumbs and no manners." Patience blushed a deep crimson and ducked her head, but a tiny smile played at the corner of her lips, a smile that made Silas forget how to breathe for a solid 3 seconds. That evening, she insisted on cooking supper, and she moved around his kitchen as if she had lived there for years, finding the salt and the skillet without being told. Silas watched her from his chair by the fire, his big hands wrapped around his knees, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling began to bloom in the hollow of his ribs. When she set a plate of biscuits and gravy before him, he bowed his head to say grace, and she joined him without hesitation, her soft voice blending with his deep rumble. After supper, they sat on the porch under a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled cream, and the silence between them felt less awkward and more like an unspoken conversation. Patience hesitantly told him that she had grown up in an orphanage in St. Louis, and that she had never known her parents or any real kindness until the pastor's wife taught her to read. Silas, emboldened by her honesty, confessed that he had been alone on this mountain for 12 years and that he sometimes talked to his horse just to hear a voice. The admission made Patience laugh, a sound like tiny silver bells, and Silas felt his ears turn pink because he had never made a woman laugh before, and it felt better than gold. The next morning, Patience woke before dawn and had breakfast ready by the time Silas stumbled out of his bedroom, which he had insisted she take to bed while he slept by the hearth. She had also tidied the cabin, hung his spare shirts to air, and placed a small bunch of wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, transforming the room into a home. Silas was so overwhelmed by the sight that he had to step outside and chop an entire cord of wood just to settle the wild beating of his heart. Over the following days, they fell into a gentle routine of shared chores and quiet companionship, each learning the other's rhythms like a dance neither had been taught but both instinctively knew. Patience discovered that Silas, despite his fearsome size, was terrified of lightning and would hum old hymns during storms to keep himself calm. Silas discovered that Patience had a mischievous streak, and she once hit his boot just to watch him hop around the cabin, laughing until tears streamed down her cheeks. But there was a shadow in Patience's eyes that Silas couldn't name, a sadness that surfaced whenever she looked at the mountains as if she were searching for a memory. One rainy afternoon, as they sat mending tack by the fire, Silas finally worked up the courage to ask her why she had agreed to marry a stranger so far from civilization. Patience set down the bridle she was oiling and took a deep breath, then looked at him with an intensity that made him feel like the entire world had narrowed to just her face. She said, "I came because I already knew you, Silas Creed, even if you do not remember me, and I have loved you since I was a little girl." Silas felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been kicked by a mule, and he could only stare at her with his mouth slightly open and his mind reeling in confusion. Patience reached across the small distance between them and took his massive, calloused hand in both of hers, holding it not like a stranger, but like a woman who had waited years for that exact moment. The instant her fingers laced through his, Silas froze as solid as the winter pond, because the way she held his hand felt so familiar that it unlocked a door in his memory he had sealed shut long ago. He saw, in a blinding flash, the image of a terrified little girl clinging to a broken raft on a flooded river, and a much younger version of himself plunging into the rapids to pull her to safety. "It was you," he whispered, his voice cracking like ice in spring. "You're that little gal from the river, the one I pulled out when the whole valley flooded back in '62. Tears spilled down Patience's cheeks as she nodded, and she told him that she had never forgotten the giant boy who had risked his life for her and then vanished into the wilderness. For 12 years, she had prayed to find him again, and when she learned from a traveling preacher that the same Silas Creed was seeking a wife, she had volunteered immediately. Silas looked down at their joined hands, hers so small and pale against his sun-browned skin, and he felt something inside him crack open and let in a flood of light. He had thought himself unworthy of love, too big and too rough for anyone to see as anything other than a beast of burden. But this woman had crossed half a continent for his sake. With a tenderness that surprised even himself, he lifted her hand and pressed it gently against his cheek, closing his eyes as a single tear traced a path through his beard. Patience leaned forward and rested her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a long, sacred moment while the rain drummed on the roof like a benediction. When Silas finally spoke, his voice was steadier than it had ever been, and he said, "I pulled you from the water once, but it seems you've been pulling me from loneliness all this time without my knowing." That evening, they talked until the fire burned down to embers, sharing every detail of their lives and discovering that their souls had been walking toward each other all along. Silas confessed that he had almost refused the matchmaker's offer, terrified of disappointing a wife, and Patience admitted she had been afraid he would reject her for not being strong. They both laughed at their mutual foolishness, and the laughter felt like a cleansing rain washing away years of isolation and doubt for both of them. The next Sunday, they rode down to the little log church in the valley, and Silas introduced Patience to the pastor and the townsfolk with a pride that made his chest swell. The pastor, who had arranged a match, beamed like a proud father and agreed to marry them right then and there with the whole congregation as witnesses. Patience wore a simple white dress that the pastor's wife had kept for just such an occasion, and Silas had tamed his wild hair with water and a borrowed comb. When the pastor pronounced them man and wife, Silas bent down and kissed Patience with a gentleness that made every woman in the room press a handkerchief to her eyes. As they rode back up the mountain that afternoon, Patience wrapped her arms around Silas's waist and pressed her face against his back, feeling his heart pound steadily through his coat. Silas pointed out landmarks to her as they climbed, naming every peak and stream, and promising that he would teach her the secrets of the high country in all its seasons. Patience told him that she didn't need to learn the secrets of the mountains, because she had already found the greatest secret of all, a heart that had been waiting for her. That night, Silas added a second chair to the table and a second pillow to the bed, small changes that felt monumental, like the first stones of a new foundation. In the months that followed, the cabin rang with laughter and conversation, and the loneliness that had haunted Silas for so long retreated like a shadow before the rising sun. Patience planted a garden in the rocky soil, coaxing stubborn vegetables from the earth with the same patient determination that had carried her across the plains. Silas found himself humming while he worked. Little tunes he had never known, he remembered, and the horses grew fatter and the cattle more contented under their joint care. Whenever Silas held her hand now, he no longer froze with shock, but he still felt that same electric wonder, and he made a point to hold it every chance he got. Patience liked to tease him about the day he had spilled water all over the floor, and Silas would blush and grumble, but he secretly loved that she remembered every detail. They welcomed their first child, a son with his father's gentle eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, in the spring of their second year together on the mountain. Silas held the baby in his enormous hands, marveling that something so tiny and perfect could exist in a world that had once felt so cold and empty. Patience watched him from the bed, her heart so full that she thought it might burst, and she whispered a prayer of thanks for floods in faith and the courage to climb a mountain for love. The town below would tell this story for generations, how a shy virgin bride crossed the wilderness to find the man who had saved her, and how that touch of her hand reminded him what it meant to be truly seen. Now, if this tale of destined love and quiet courage has touched your heart, then you are exactly where you belong with the Western Tales official family, and we'd be honored to have you subscribe and ride with us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this story a like if it warmed your soul. And remember that sometimes the greatest journeys are the ones that lead us home to the hands that were always meant to hold ours.